Legend of Zelda, easily one of the most beloved and acclaimed series of all time, spanning over 25 years, numerous 10 out of 10 games, and being responsible for some of the best moments in video game history. Now that's certainly an impressive resume. Now there are many standout aspects of the Zelda series, but the one that stands out the most and is the best part of the series is the legendaries? No, that's Pokemon. The atmosphere? That's Metroid. The power-ups? That's Mega Man. The difficulty? That's Dark Souls. The waifus? That's Fire Emblem. Box only, no items found destination? That's Smash Brothers. The dungeons? Yes, thank you, that's exactly the answer I was looking for. Took you guys long enough. Dungeons in The Legend of Zelda are the moments people look forward to the most, as they test the player on everything they know and combine exploration, puzzle solving and combat and many other aspects seamlessly together, resulting in some of the most fun you can have in any video game, period. And considering the number of games the Zelda series has and the amount of dungeons within each game, it's no wonder the Zelda series is so loved. Granted, not every dungeon is a fun time, but 9 times out of 10 dungeons in The Legend of Zelda are an experience no other video games can compare to. So with all these dungeons to choose from, I bet you're wondering which of them are my 10 favourite. Also the fact that this video is called Top 10 Zelda Dungeons, but nevertheless, that's why we're here today. So join me everyone, as it's time to put our power, wisdom and courage to the test as I count down my top 10 dungeons from The Legend of Zelda series. Just a few things to clear up before we begin. First off, this is just my opinion, and when ranking dungeons there are many aspects to consider, such as the design of the dungeons, the items you get and how they're used, their difficulty, the puzzle solving, the boss battles, the music, you get the idea. Secondly is that I'm looking at fully fledged dungeons, not mini dungeons or enemy gauntlets, as well as no final dungeons or Ganon's Tower type levels. And thirdly, I'm not doing the 1 dungeon per game rule because some Zelda games have dungeons that are so good that they just have to be on here. Also, just a heads up, I'm a bigger fan of the 3D Zelda games over the 2D ones, just thought I'd let you know that beforehand. And with all that cleared up, it's time for us to get to the real meat of this adventure, as these dungeons are the best of the best and will not hold back on testing you in every way possible. Well, if that's the case, I think it's safe to say that my body is ready. The Dark Palace. Seems fitting that we start off with a dungeon from the 2D Zelda game since I prefer the 3D ones overall. I actually feel the same way about 3D Sonic, 3D Mario games? Dodged a bullet on that one. Now back to the topic at hand. Starting off this list we have the Dark Palace. Easily my favourite dungeon in A Link to the Past, and being a dungeon that set the standard for the second half of the game and showed you that the Dark World meant business, as this was a big step up from the first 3 dungeons, and even after all these years it still holds up very well against the newer and more complex dungeons, which makes sense since this game is a classic among classics, and at this point this game is old enough to drink. Well, I know what I'm ordering the next time I go out drinking. The Dark Palace is the 4th dungeon in A Link to the Past and is the first palace you tackle in the Dark World. Right off the bat, you know that the game is no longer holding your hand, as just by exploring a bit of this dungeon will give you an idea what to expect, especially with that really ominous music. The dungeon is considerably more difficult than the first 3, having trickier puzzles to solve, harder enemies to fight, and some rather unconventional methods of exploration. Man, I'm getting some serious Prime 2 vibes right now. Now this dungeon isn't really anything special or has a specific gimmick to it like other dungeons do, instead being more focused on using your wits and skill to figure out things and balancing out each element of Zelda dungeons nicely. And I kind of prefer that since it's more about the player overcoming obstacles rather than relying on fighting against a specific trope of the dungeon. Fuck you, Ice Palace, without that cane you're a bitch and a half! Not to mention, this dungeon has the best boss battle in A Link to the Past, the Helmassar King, and is overall just a really solid dungeon which has held up considerably well over the years. And considering the types of dungeons the series will produce after this game, that is certainly saying a lot. The Temple of Time. 2 words. Nostalgia blindness. We all have it, we've all experienced it, and sometimes we can't help but love something more than we should because of it. I mean, it's because of nostalgia blindness that I can watch Dragon Ball Z over and over again, despite the fact that it really isn't that good. Well, the Temple of Time is very much the same situation, since it's an overall good dungeon, but it's nothing amazing. However, because the Temple of Time is something I'll never forget, and upon hearing that familiar choir at the entrance of the temple, the nostalgia just hit me like a wave, and thus, here we are. The dark side of nostalgia has clouded your vision, young Skywalker. Yeah, but I ain't complaining. The Temple of Time is the 6th dungeon in Twilight Princess and is accessed after going through the Sacred Grove for a second time. Now I'll be blunt, the Temple of Time isn't that great of a temple. I mean, the puzzle solving isn't anything spectacular, there's not as much exploration as I'd like, it looks a little bland and isn't too hard either. With that said though, I still think there are aspects of this temple that are really good. For one thing, the enemies you fight in this dungeon are some of the more exotic enemies and make the combat in this dungeon a lot more fun, especially when fighting the Dark Knight. That was just 100% awesome. Secondly, I actually think the item you get, the Dominion Rod, is rather well incorporated into this dungeon for both puzzle solving and combat. Third is that the more linear structure makes this temple much more fast paced and fun to tackle, and there's overall a lot less time wasting and backtracking. Fourth is that it's the Temple of Time, people. I mean, just being back in one of the most iconic areas in Ocarina of Time and hearing the same music makes you feel all warm inside. And come on, sometimes we can't help but let nostalgia get the better of us from time to time. Putting the Temple of Time on here might be stretching it since there are probably other dungeons that deserve this spot, but I can't help but really like this dungeon, since it knows exactly what it wants to be and is very light on the bullshit, so you know exactly what you're getting into with this dungeon. Turtle Rock. A Link Between Worlds has got to be one of the biggest surprises I've ever played, since while I like A Link to the Past, I think it's a milestone for the series. It's not my favourite Zelda game and I don't play it nearly as much as the others, so I wasn't expecting much from A Link Between Worlds. However, A Link Between Worlds shocked me with just how good it was, being in my opinion better than A Link to the Past in every way and making most of the dungeons much better as well, with Turtle Rock getting a huge improvement and becoming the best dungeon in the game. Man, Nintendo are masters when it comes to remaking and reimagining their old games, which begs the question as to why Nintendo won't remake these particular games. Oh wait, they're too busy rolling in all that Pokemon money. Turtle Rock is technically the 6th Dark World dungeon in A Link Between Worlds, but you can tackle any Dark World dungeon in any order in that game, something I'm very grateful for, mind you. Now, when A Link to the Past, I wasn't a big fan of Turtle Rock because of all those damn moving platforms. Thankfully, this game swapped all those moving platforms for glorious and thought-provoking puzzle solving. So yeah, if you like puzzle solving, this dungeon is for you since you're going to be doing a lot of it, either by using the ice rod to create makeshift platforms to traverse through the environment, or moving between different levels on each floor to access many switches and entrances to other rooms. Being one of the later dungeons in the game, Turtle Rock is most certainly challenging, as often some of the obstacles require a lot of forward thinking and expert use of your arsenal to overcome them. While it can be intimidating for the first time player, the sense of accomplishment you get from solving these puzzles is something even some of the console Zelda games cannot achieve. I'll admit this dungeon isn't perfect since there aren't many exciting enemy encounters, and if you don't know what you're doing, this dungeon can really drag, but even still, completing this dungeon is more than worth the effort, providing some of the most complex and exciting puzzle solving in this series and really making you think your way to victory. Now that's certainly using your brain. The Fire Sanctuary. The Fire Sanctuary is a funny kind of dungeon, since the lead up to this place is one of the most infamous moments in Skyward Sword, which is actually quite a bold statement considering all the hate this game gets. While certainly annoying, I feel it's more than worth the struggle, because the Fire Sanctuary is an awesome dungeon, easily one of the most varied and original dungeons the Zelda series has ever produced, so you can think of it as the gold at the end of the rainbow. Actually, based on that summary of starting out bad but getting much better later on, I'm not sure if I was talking about Skyward Sword or Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. The Fire Sanctuary is the 6th dungeon in Skyward Sword and is accessed after going through every gamer's most hated of cliches, the dreaded escort mission. The dungeon itself is certainly a highlight of the game, since I don't think I've played through a Zelda dungeon with as much variety as this one. I mean, all the different enemies you fight, areas you explore, puzzles to solve and ways of traversing through this dungeon make this one of the most original and varied dungeons in the Zelda series, and it offers up something for just about any Zelda player. It's like I always say, variety's the spice of life? Yes. Thank you so much for butting in, Hinoka.
We should do this more often.
Right off the bat, this dungeon starts with using water to make makeshift lava platforms. Standard stuff, right? Well then soon after that, boom! Giant lava hands lifting you up to new areas. Boom! You're now carrying bombs to raise the lava level. Boom! Now you're exploring underground to open switches. Boom! Now you're skydiving into split pathways in order to solve more puzzles. Boom! I think I went a bit overboard there. Indeed, this dungeon is filled with many different areas and obstacles, with each being equally as fun, as well as having the best boss fight in Skyward Sword. Zelda dungeons are often criticised for being too gimmicky or focusing too much on a specific trope. Well, thankfully, the Fire Sanctuary doesn't have to worry about that, as it is easily one of the most varied and unique dungeons in the Zelda series that anyone can enjoy. Guess this baby's got all the bases covered. The Forest Temple. Much like A Link to the Past, once Link pulls the Master Sword from its pedestal, the game suddenly takes a dark twist and the second half of the game becomes much more epic and grand, and also like A Link to the Past, the Forest Temple sets the standard for the second half of the game and lets you know that the kid gloves are literally off. While this scenario seems very similar, this isn't exactly a bad thing. I mean, it's worked for Mario all this time. as the Forest Temple really does up the ante and is one of the most challenging and complex dungeons for this point in the game, but also one of the most memorable and atmospheric dungeons even after all these years, kinda like the Dark Palace. I think the point's crystal clear by now, so let's move on, shall we? The Forest Temple is the 4th dungeon in Ocarina of Time, and it's the first dungeon you tackle as adult Link. You can tell the moment you set foot into this dungeon that this is no walk in the park despite all the scenery, as the first thing that stands out about this place is its atmosphere. The Forest Temple gives off this really mysterious and spooky vibe with the music that plays and the overall look of the dungeon, resembling some form of art gallery that transitions into garden areas, as well as all the twisted hallways and mazes. This also translates into the design of the dungeon, since for the first time player this can be one of the trickier dungeons in the game, as there's quite a bit of exploring to do and it's easy to get lost if you don't know where to go. While this can be a turn-off, the Forest Temple is also one of the most enjoyable dungeons to travel through, as there's a very nice blend of exploration, puzzle solving and combat, and it's always making you do something new and exciting, not to mention having the unforgettable fight against Phantom Ganon in his series debut. It seems the similarities between A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time are becoming all the more apparent, but that's not necessarily a bad thing since it is a link to the past after all, and much like the Dark Palace, the Forest Temple does a wonderful job of letting you know that you're in the deep end now, and the challenge of this dungeon and the fun factor provided conveys that perfectly. Dragon Roost Cavern. First impressions are a big part of any video game, and you want to make sure you start off on the right note in order to keep the player's attention. You know, unless you're these games. Zelda is often very good at this, as the first dungeons tend to be a great way for the player to get used to what the game has in store for them, and I feel Dragon Roost Cavern from the Wind Waker is the best first dungeon in any Zelda game. This dungeon is easily one of the biggest and most complex first dungeons in the Zelda game, which might seem scary at first, but the way in which it's designed makes it easy enough for the first time player to conquer, and also great amounts of fun on each playthrough, and it's something I always look forward to every time I play the Wind Waker. Dragon Roost Cavern is the very first dungeon in the Wind Waker. No, the first time going through Forsaken Fortress doesn't count, though by the looks of it you think this was the second dungeon given the series' history and tropes. Right off the bat, this is one of the most intimidating first dungeons in a Zelda game. I mean, just look around, you're inside a volcano filled with lava pits, very dark rooms, and you go outside on occasion just to see how high up you really are. Better not look down then. Dragon Roost Cavern is certainly one of the more challenging first dungeons in a Zelda game, having loads of exploration to do, a good chunk of puzzle solving and a decent amount of combat. Despite this dungeon is very well balanced and shouldn't be too much of a hassle to get through if you think ahead, along with rewarding players who go out of their way to explore as much as possible with many hidden goodies and collectibles, not to mention having easily the best Gomhod battle to date. Zelda games always tend to start off strong with their first dungeons, and I feel no other game does this better than the Wind Waker and Dragon Roost Cavern, easily being one of the grandest and most challenging first dungeons in the Zelda game, but never to the point of being unfair or off-putting. I believe the term hitting the ground running is a suitable acronym for this situation. The Arbiters Grounds. You know how Ocarina of Time was structured similarly to A Link to the Past? Well, Twilight Princess was structured similarly to Ocarina of Time, only it was way more obvious about it. I mean, come on, it wasn't even trying to be subtle. With that in mind, like Ocarina of Time, the 4th dungeon sets the standard for the rest of the game, and well, the Arbiters Grounds sets one hell of a standard, since this is easily the best dungeon in Twilight Princess and was a huge step up from the first 3 dungeons, which were already pretty good dungeons to begin with, having some of the best puzzle solving, use of the item acquired, mini-boss and boss battles in the entire Zelda series, and trust me, I do not say that lightly. The Arbiters Grounds is the 4th dungeon in Twilight Princess and is accessed after playing through one of the most awesome moments in Twilight Princess, so this temple has a lot to live up to. And it does! At first it seems like a typical sand or desert temple, but visually I think this temple looks really cool, especially with all the detail put into the backgrounds and the sheer size of the temple. While this dungeon is rather large, there's a very nice mix of puzzle solving and some really awesome fights plastered in between, so the temple has enough variety going for it to prevent it from becoming stale, which is good because I'll admit, there's a good amount of backtracking in this dungeon, which can at times become a bit of a hassle to traverse. The Arbiters Grounds is just an overall really solid dungeon, doing well in just about everything and not really lacking in any areas. Plus this dungeon gives you one of the most useful, yet at the same time useless items in the Zelda series, the spinner, and really makes good use out of it, especially in the boss battle against Starlord, which is easily the best boss battle in Twilight Princess, bar none. It seems that Zelda games have a knack for being similar to one another in certain areas, but considering just how good Zelda games are, well, most of them, I won't complain at the end of the day, especially with a dungeon like the Arbiters Grounds. Now we'll just have to wait and see what game Breath of the Wild will be similar to, and judging by the size of that game, I'm putting my money on the Wind Waker. The Spirit Temple. If you want a prime example of how to make the best use out of your game's mechanics and assets, look no further than the Spirit Temple from Ocarina of Time. I'd also throw games like Portal and Zone of the Enders 2 into the mix, but the point still stands. The Spirit Temple from Ocarina of Time makes the use out of everything the game has to offer, and results in being not only one of the best dungeons in the Zelda series, but easily the best dungeon in Ocarina of Time, and an experience the likes of which most Zelda games can't even come close to achieving. I mean, yes, there are 2 more dungeons that are better than this one, but we'll get there when we get there. The Spirit Temple is the 8th and final normal dungeon in Ocarina of Time, and is accessed after clearing the Gerudo Fortress and crossing the desert. What makes this temple so good is how it literally incorporates all the items acquired, enemies faced, and puzzles solved together, while having its own unique elements and being able to tackle the dungeons both young and adult Link. This is easily the most standout part of the dungeon, and good god does it make the experience so much more magical, as you have to master both young and adult Link skills and items to get through this dungeon, and each section is designed with the 2 Links in mind, not to mention having one of the Link's actions affecting the other's journey. Synergy, you gotta love it. Playing as the 2 Links results in this temple being very large, and there's a lot of exploration to be done. However, the challenges in each room gives this temple a lot of variety, and it's never dull for a second. This is topped up with some great new items like the oh so lovely Mirror Shield, fighting some of the most dangerous enemies in the game, the Iron Knuckles, as well as the best boss fight in the game, Twin Rover. God, I love this temple so much. Zelda games have always had a knack for making the best use out of their mechanics and gameplay features, and I feel the Spirit Temple is to date one of, if not the best dungeons to demonstrate this. Man, I freaking love Zelda. The Stone Tower Temple. The time mechanic in Majora's Mask, while a defining feature of the game and implemented very well, is often criticised for not allowing players enough time to fully explore the dungeons at their leisure, and this is often in regards to the Stone Tower Temple. And to be honest, I can see where people are coming from, since this is one of the largest, most complex, most challenging and devious dungeons in the Zelda series. And I can't help but love it! I mean, holy shit, this temple is amazing and hands down the best temple in Majora's Mask. And before any of you cry masochists, let me assure you that I am nothing of the sort. If I was, I wouldn't have stopped playing through Awakening on lunatic mode. Never again, man. Never again. The Stone Tower Temple is the 4th and final dungeon in Majora's Mask and is accessed after clearing Ikana Castle, which in all honesty is very much a dungeon in of itself. From the get-go, this dungeon is throwing both old and new obstacles at you as you explore it in order to keep you engaged, but as you traverse through the dungeon, going about your business, you'll notice quite a few ceiling objects that cannot be accessed. Once you get the light arrows and realise you have the power to flip the dungeon on its head, you head back outside and literally turn the world upside down. This is the unique selling point of the Stone Tower Temple, as this dungeon is essentially split into 2 halves, and in order to fully explore it, you need to switch between both when need be, in order to overcome some of the trickier obstacles and find all the hidden goodies, making this one of the most difficult and perplexing dungeons to date, and to be honest with Majora's Mask's time limit, I can see why people would hate this dungeon. However, I'm having way too much fun tackling all the challenges this dungeon has in store, as well as having one of the most epic boss fights in the series, Twin Mold. I mean, this is some Pacific Rim style shit right here. Majora's Mask isn't an easy game to get into, and while this temple can certainly rub people the wrong way, I for one love this temple to bits, having a little bit of everything, and I mean everything, as well as at the same time being one of the most unique and original dungeons in the series. There's a reason that Majora's Mask is my favourite Zelda game. Before we get to number 1, I just want to do a few honourable mentions. First is the Sand Ship from Skyward Sword. The Sand Ship was a very unique dungeon with how it used the time stones, and the puzzle solving was great, but there was a lot of back and forth in this dungeon and the boss fight was kinda meh. Next is the Earth Temple from Wind Waker. The Earth Temple is easily one of the most atmospheric dungeons in any Zelda game and has some brilliant puzzle solving, but sometimes trying to traverse this thing can be a bit of a hassle. After that, there's Woodfall from Majora's Mask. Next to Dragon Roost Cavern, this is the best first dungeon in any Zelda game, being rather challenging for the first time player and overall a lot of fun, just not as much as the other dungeons on this list. And finally there's the Tower of Hera from A Link Between Worlds. This temple pretty much made everything about the original better and added in new elements to make it feel fresh and new. It just wasn't enough to put it in the top 10. Anyway, with that out of the way, on to the number 1 entry. The Ancient Cistern. Best dungeon ever. Say what you want about Skyward Sword, and believe me, people have said many things about Skyward Sword, but look me in the eye and tell me that the Ancient Cistern from Skyward Sword isn't a good dungeon. See, you just can't do it. That's because you hide under a helmet and we can't look you in the eye. Corin? Who let you in here? While it may not be your favourite dungeon, I think we can all agree that the Ancient Cistern is a great dungeon, as this dungeon has everything. It looks beautiful, makes great use out of the item acquired, has a brilliant mix of action, exploration and puzzle solving, actually uses the water to its advantage unlike pretty much every other Zelda dungeon, has one of the best bosses in the series, and is just an all-around amazing dungeon. All the more reason as to why I feel Skyward Sword gets way too much hate. The Ancient Cistern is the 4th dungeon in Skyward Sword and is accessed after meeting with the Water Dragon. Aside from excelling in everything a typical dungeon has, this dungeon has a lot of its own unique gimmicks that add to the dungeon rather than take away from it. This takes the form of the water sections, which may raise a red flag at first because, you know. However, the way it's used in tandem with Skyward Sword's swimming mechanics actually makes the water section some of the best parts of the dungeon. Plus, you will be switching between the upper and lower levels of the dungeon in order to access it fully, and each section not only contrasts each other visually, but they also have different types of puzzle solving, enemies and layouts that makes travelling through each section a completely different and unique experience. In all my time playing The Legend of Zelda, I have never seen a dungeon pull off so many different elements so well as the Ancient Cistern, and the way it does this is masterfully done, making the experience as a whole just pure and utter bliss. And there you have it. The Ancient Cistern from Skyward Sword is my favourite dungeon in the Legend of Zelda series. While the other dungeons on this list are great and some of them are downright amazing, none of them have been able to reach the level of polish and sheer brilliance as the Ancient Cistern, being a dungeon that is literally perfect and easily the best part of one of the most overhated games of all time, which is why it takes the #1 spot as my favourite dungeon in the Legend of Zelda series. This has been Blazing Knight. I wish you all a great night, take care, and while there are many aspects of the Zelda series that we love, the one aspect I believe stands above all others are the dungeons, and if these 10 are any evidence, they're responsible for some of the best moments in some of the best games of all time. Well, now that Zelda is out of the way for now, I wonder which franchise to tackle next. I mean, there are so many to choose from, I don't know where to start. Perhaps I should... What's this? Someone's requesting to be transmitted to my location? Okay, sure, I wonder who it could be. Well, it's about damn time! Hey everyone, thank you for watching today's video. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and why not subscribe to my channel in order to keep up to date with when the new videos are coming out. For alternate video recommendations, I first point you to my last video, Top 10 Fire Emblem Units That Have Grown On Me, where I count down my top 10 Fire Emblem units that have grown on me over time. Next up, I'm pointing to Top 10 Zelda bosses, where I look at my 10 favourite bosses from the Legend of Zelda series, and for something completely different, why not check out Top 5 Monster Hunter Weapons, where I count down my top 5 favourite weapons for the Monster Hunter series. Hopefully one of those videos will be to your liking. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I want to give a quick shout out to the Fire Emblem playthrough community on Amino. They're a community dedicated to playthroughs of Fire Emblem games and talking about each other's experiences, as well as discussing Fire Emblem as a whole, so if you're interested in that type of thing, be sure to check them out. Anyway, that's it from me, I'll see you all next time.